Guy de Maupassant. Bertha, my elderly friend, for sometimes one befriends people much older than oneself. My elderly friend Dr. Bonnet had insistently invited me to visit him in Rheims. I was entirely unfamiliar with the Auvergne region, and in the middle of the summer of 1876, I decided to go see him. I arrived on the morning train, and the doctor was the first person I saw at the station. My friend was dressed in a gray suit and a round, black hat of soft felt, with a wide brim and a very high crown that tapered towards the top, much like a chimney pot, a genuine Auvergne Coleman's hat. Thus attired, and wearing a light-colored jacket, gaunt and large-headed, the doctor resembled a white-haired youth. He embraced me with unconcealed joy, as provincials often do when welcoming a long-awaited guest, then swept his arm in a wide gesture and proudly exclaimed, "Behold the Auvergne!" Before me, I saw only a mountain chain with peaks shaped like truncated cones, evidently extinct volcanoes. Then, pointing to the name of the station inscribed on the facade of the station building, he said, "Rheims, the birthplace of lawyers, the pride of the judiciary, though one would think it ought to be the birthplace of physicians." I asked, "Why?" He answered with a laugh, "Why? Reverse the word and you get mori, that is, to die. That, young man, is why I've settled in this area." And, delighted with his own joke, he led me away, rubbing his hands together cheerfully. I had barely finished a cup of coffee with milk before I had to set about touring the old town. I admired the apothecary's house and other famous Rheims houses with their stone-carved facades, blackened by time, yet as charming as trinkets. I admired the statue of the Madonna, patroness of butchers, and even heard, on that subject, the tale of an amusing adventure, which I shall recount another time. Then Dr. Bonnet said, "Now, permit me to slip away for 5 minutes to visit a patient, and afterwards I will take you to the Château Hill. I will show you a panoramic view of the town and the entire chain of the Puy de Dôme before lunch. Wait for me on the street. I shall return directly." He left me near one of the old provincial mansions, dark, enclosed, silent, and grim. But this particular house seemed especially sinister to me, and I soon understood the reason. All the windows on the second floor were half-shuttered with solid wooden blinds. Only the very tops of the windows were left open, as if to prevent those locked inside this large stone chest from looking out onto the street. When the doctor returned, I shared my observations with him. He replied, "You are not mistaken. The unfortunate creature being kept in that house must never see what happens beyond its walls. She is a madwoman, or rather, a simpleton, or more precisely still, an idiot, or, as they say in your Normandy, touched. Ah, it is a sad story, but also a most curious pathological case. Would you like me to tell you?" I agreed. He continued, "This is the matter. Some 20 years ago, a child was born to the owners of this mansion. My patient's a girl, a seemingly perfectly normal little girl. But I soon noticed that, despite the excellent physical development of this little being, its mind was not awakening. She began to walk very early, but could not speak at all. At first I thought she was deaf, but later I ascertained that her hearing was excellent, though she understood nothing. She would startle, become frightened by a sudden noise, but could not comprehend its cause. She grew up, becoming a beauty, albeit a mute one, mute due to her feeble-mindedness. I tried every means to make even the faintest glimmer of consciousness shine in her brain. All was in vain. I thought she recognized her wet nurse, but when the girl was weaned, she ceased to recognize her. She never learned to say the word mama, the first word babbled by children and the last whispered by soldiers dying on the battlefield. Sometimes she would mutter something incoherent or shriek piercingly, like an infant, and that was all. In fine weather, she would laugh incessantly and emit light cries, similar to birdsong. When it rained, she would weep, moan, and howl grimly and ominously, like a dog howling for the dead. She adored sprawling in the grass, much like a young animal, would run about wildly, and whenever the morning sun peered through the window, she would invariably start clapping her hands. If the window was opened, she would also begin to clap and bounce on her bed, eager to be dressed more quickly. It seemed she saw no distinction between people whatsoever. She did not differentiate her mother from her nurse, her father from me, or the coachman from the cook. I felt genuine pity for her parents, those most unfortunate people, and visited them nearly every day. I often stayed for dinner and observed that Bertha, she had been named Bertha, seemed to have some discernment regarding food, preferring some dishes over others. At that time, she had just turned 12. Physically, she was as developed as an 18-year-old and was already taller than me. It was then that the idea came to me to cultivate in her a love for delicacies and attempt, by this means, to implant in her brain a notion of the difference between things, to accustom her, through a variety of taste sensations, through a whole gastronomic scale, if not to conscious judgments, then at least to a semi-instinctive choice, which would itself constitute a kind of primitive work of thought. Afterwards, having instilled in her preferences for certain dishes and carefully selected those which could be utilized, the next step was to achieve a sort of reverse effect of the body upon the psyche, thereby gradually expanding the scope of her barely perceptible mental activity. And so, one day, I placed 2 plates before her, one with soup, the other with an exceedingly sweet vanilla cream. I made her taste each dish in turn. Then I gave her the freedom to choose. She ate the cream. Soon, I made a true gourmand of her, such a gourmand that it seemed there was only one thought in her head, or rather, one single desire, to eat. She distinguished dishes perfectly, reached for those she liked, and seized them greedily. She would cry when they were taken from her. I then decided to train her to come to the dining room at the sound of a bell. This was not achieved immediately, but in the end, I succeeded. In her vague consciousness, an idea undoubtedly formed of some connection between sound and taste, a correlation between them, a call and response, resulting in something akin to an association, if one can call the subconscious link between 2 perceptions an association. I continued the experiment and taught her, but with what difficulty, to recognize mealtime by the clock face. For a long time, I could not attract Bertha's attention to the clock hands, but I managed to awaken her interest in the striking of the clock. I achieved this by a very simple means. I dispensed with the dinner bell, and everyone would rise from their seats to go to the table as soon as the copper hammer began to strike noon. But I could not, by any means, teach her to count the strokes of the hammer. She would rush to the door every time the clock chimed. However, little by little, she began to understand that not every chime was related to food, and her gaze, guided by her hearing, began to frequently rest upon the clock face. Noticing this, every day at noon and at 6 o'clock, as the moment she anticipated drew near, I began pointing my finger at the number 12 and the number 6. Soon I saw that she was intently following the movement of the small copper hands, which I often adjusted before her eyes. So, she had understood, or rather, she had assimilated it. I had managed to implant in her brain, if not an understanding, then at least a sensation of time. After all, One can achieve even this with carp by feeding them regularly at specific hours, though they have no visual aid like a clock. After this success, all the timepieces in the house became the object of her exclusive attention. From morning till evening, she would examine them, listen for their chime, and await it. Once a rather amusing incident even occurred. The charming Louis XVI-style wall clock hanging at the head of her bed had broken and no longer struck the hours, and she noticed this immediately. She didn't take her eyes off the hands, waiting for it to strike 10. But the hand passed the mark, and Bertha was so stunned by the silence that she sank onto a chair, clearly seized by that cruel anxiety which grips us in the face of great catastrophes. She decided to see what would happen next, and sat before the clock with incredible patience until 11. Of course, this time, too, she heard nothing. Then, suddenly possessed, whether by the mad rage of a deceived, deluded creature, or by horror before an incomprehensible mystery, or finally, simply by the furious impatience of a passionate nature confronted with an obstacle, she seized the fireplace tongs and brought them down upon the clock with such force that it instantly shattered to pieces. So, her brain was functioning. She could reason, albeit through obscure paths and within very narrow limits. For I had never succeeded in teaching her to distinguish between people as she distinguished the times of day. To awaken a glimmer of consciousness in her, one had to appeal to her passions in the physiological sense of the word. Soon we received another confirmation of this fact. Alas, a dreadful one. She had become a beauty. She was, in the full sense of the word, a flawless specimen of the female sex, a kind of marvelous, yet mindless Venus. She had turned 16, and I had rarely seen such perfection of line, such a stately figure, such regular features. I called her Venus. Yes, she was a Venus, golden-haired, radiant with health, strong, with large eyes, light and empty, blue like a flax flower, with a large mouth and full lips. She had the mouth of a sensualist, a sensual woman, a mouth made for kisses. And so, one morning her father came to me. He had a strange expression on his face, and, without even returning my greeting, he said, sinking into a chair, "I need to speak with you about a very serious matter. What do you think? Is it possible to marry Bertha off?" I started with astonishment and exclaimed, "Bertha? Marry? But that's unthinkable." He continued, "Yes, I understand, but consider, doctor, what if? We hoped so much, perhaps she would have children, and it would be such a shock for her, such happiness. And, who knows, perhaps motherhood would awaken her consciousness." I was extremely perplexed. There was a logic to it. It was quite probable that this new feeling for her, that wondrous maternal instinct planted in the heart of every woman and every female, which makes a hen fly at a dog to defend her chicks, could produce a sudden revolution in her sleeping brain and set in motion the idle mechanism of her thought. I immediately recalled, moreover, an instance from my own observations. A few years prior, I had a hunting dog so dull that nothing could be done with her. She had a litter of puppies, and the very next day she became, not exactly intelligent, but certainly no more foolish than many other not particularly clever dogs. No sooner had I conceived of this possibility than I felt a desire growing within me to see Bertha married, less out of sympathy for her and her unfortunate parents than for the sake of scientific interest. What would come of it? A most curious problem. So I said to her father, "Perhaps you're right. Why not try? Go ahead, but I doubt you will find a man who would agree to such a marriage." He said quietly, I already have a suitor for her." I was astonished and asked, stammering, "A respectable man? From your own circle?" He replied, "Yes, of course." "Ah, but may I know his name?" "That is precisely why I have come, to confide in you and seek your advice. It is Monsieur Gaston du Bois-Lucé." I barely restrained myself from exclaiming, "What a scoundrel!" But, collecting myself, I said after a moment's silence, "Very well. I see no obstacles." The poor man shook my hand. "We shall have the wedding in a month," he said. Monsieur Gaston du Bois-Lucé was a rake from a good family. Having squandered his paternal inheritance and accumulated debts through various dubious means, he was now in search of an income. And he had found it. A handsome and imposing man, yet a debauchee from that despicable breed of provincial revelers, he seemed to me a suitable husband for Bertha. One could later buy him off by providing settlement. He began visiting the house, paying court, playing the fool before this beautiful simpleton, who, however, seemed to please him. He brought flowers, kissed her hands, sat at her feet, and gazed at her tenderly. But she remained indifferent to his attentions and did not distinguish him from others around her. The wedding took place. You understand, of course, how intensely my curiosity was aroused. The next day, I visited Bertha to discern from her expression how this event had affected her. But she remained unchanged, still wholly absorbed in the clocks and her dinner. He, on the contrary, seemed enamored, endeavored to amuse and engage his wife, flirted with her, and teased her like a kitten. He could think of nothing better to do. I began visiting the newlyweds frequently, and soon noticed that the young woman now recognized her husband and cast upon him the same greedy glances she had hitherto reserved only for sweet dishes. She watched his movements, distinguished his footsteps on the staircase and in adjacent rooms, clapped her hands when he entered, and her face would transform, illuminated by a flame of profound joy and desire. She loved him with all her soul, with all her wretched, impoverished soul, with all the wretched heart of a grateful animal. It was a truly touching and naive picture of passion, simple, carnal, yet at the same time chaste, the kind with which nature herself endows living beings, before man complicates and disfigures it with every nuance of feeling. But the husband soon grew weary of this beautiful, ardent, and silent creature. He began spending only a few hours a day with her, considering it quite sufficient to give her his nights. And she came to know suffering. From morning till evening she waited for her husband, her gaze fixed on the clocks. She even lost interest in food, because he always dined out in Clermont, in Chateauguay, in Royat, anywhere but at home. She grew thin. All other thoughts, all other desires, all other aspirations, all other vague hopes vanished from her. The hours spent without him became hours of cruel torment. Soon he ceased spending nights at home. He passed his evenings with women at the casino in Royat and returned only at dawn. She refused to go to bed until his arrival. She sat motionless on a chair, her intent gaze never leaving the small copper hands as they moved relentlessly, slowly and steadily, across the faience circle marked with numbers. She recognized the clatter of his horse's hooves from afar and would start up immediately. And when he crossed the threshold of the room, she would point a ghostly gesture at the clock face, as if saying, "See how late it is." Gradually, he began to feel fear of this lovesick and jealous mad woman and grew irritable, as is typical of coarse natures. One evening, he struck her. "They sent for me." She was thrashing in convulsions, growling in a violent paroxysm of despair, rage, or passion. Who can decipher what stirs in such a primitive consciousness? I calmed her with injections of morphine and forbade that man to be admitted to her, understanding that the marriage would inevitably lead to her destruction. It was then that she lost her mind completely. Yes, my dear friend, this simpleton went mad. She thinks of him constantly and waits for him. She waits for him all day and all night, waking and sleeping at this moment and always. Seeing her grow ever thinner, her gaze fixed on the clock face, I gave orders to remove from the house everything that reminded her of time. Thus, I deprived her of the ability to count the hours and ceaselessly stir the vague memories of when he used to return home. I hope, in the end, to kill the memory within her and extinguish that faint spark of consciousness I myself had once labored so hard to kindle. The other day, I conducted an experiment. I gave her my pocket watch. She took it, examined it for a while, and then let out a wild shriek, as if the sight of that small mechanism had suddenly awakened a memory already faded. Now she is terribly thin, so thin as to inspire pity, her eyes sunken and feverishly bright, and she constantly paces the room like a caged beast. I have ordered the windows barred, heavy shutters installed, and all the chairs nailed to the floor, so she cannot peer out into the street in hopes of seeing his return. Oh, her unfortunate parents! What a bitter lot has befallen them. We climbed the hill. The doctor turned to me and said, "Admire Riam from here." The town had the severe appearance of an ancient fortress. Behind it stretched a vast green, wooded plain, dotted with villages and small towns, veiled in a light bluish haze that lent a particular charm to the landscape. To my right, a mountain range rose in the distance with a series of peaks, some rounded, others as if sheared off by a saber stroke. The doctor began listing the names of the surrounding areas and mountain peaks, recounting their history. But I did not listen to him. I thought only of the madwoman. I saw only her. She seemed to hover, like a sinister spirit, over this entire vast region. And I suddenly asked, "And what became of her husband?" My friend seemed slightly surprised, but, after a moment's hesitation, replied, "He resides in Royat, and an allowance is paid to him. He is content and devotes himself to debauchery." As we made our way back at a leisurely pace, both sorrowful and silent, an English carriage, drawn by a thoroughbred horse galloping at full speed, overtook us. The doctor seized my arm. There he is. I managed to catch only a glimpse of a gray felt hat, tilted to one side, and broad shoulders disappearing in a cloud of dust. Ladies and gentlemen, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories. Share your impressions and thoughts in the comments. I will be pleased to chat with you.